Today's episode of the Counselling Tutor Podcast is sponsored by Web Healer. You're a counsellor in private practice and you need a website, or you've got an existing website which you need help with. Web Healer are offering Counselling Tutor Podcast listeners, that's you, £100 off the cost of a website design and build. Now, Web Healers specialise in websites for counsellors and psychotherapists. It's what they do. And the Web Healer team provide a completely non-technical, done-for-you solution, leaving you to focus your time on your clients. Operating for 20 years, Web Healer are a trusted resource amongst counsellors when it comes to getting your practice online. So get the package details and claim your £100 off coupon for your new website by going to counsellingtutor.com/website. That's counsellingtutor.com/website.
Hi, I'm Rory and welcome to episode 296 of the Counselling Tutor Podcast. Our special guest is Phil Mitchell. He's a senior BACP accredited counsellor, psychotherapist and supervisor. He holds an accredited diploma in person-centred counselling and psychotherapy from the University of Warwick. He has a postgraduate certificate in person-centred supervision from Temenos. He's also an accredited cognitive behavioural therapist holding a qualification from the University of Birmingham. He's also an author and professional speaker on the subject of male sexual abuse. Today, Phil joins us to explore the infrequently discussed subject of abuse by women towards men, and we'll be delving into a subject of misandry, a term which denotes contempt for or ingrained prejudice against men. And with that said, let's get on with today's episode.
Welcome to the Counselling Tutor Podcast, the must-listen-to podcast for counsellors, psychotherapists, and counselling students. Here are your hosts, Rory Lise Oakes and Ken Kelly.
Oh, such a warm welcome to you, our listeners, to episode 296 of the Counselling Tutor Podcast. Rory and I are delighted that you have joined us. And a great episode for you today with 3 stops on the journey, one which Rory has already given you a sneak peek at. But we're going to start with ethical, sustainable practice, where today we're speaking about self-care strategies and navigating lone working in counselling. Such a very important topic that we're going to dive into there. In Practice Matters today, Rory's already given you a sneak peek. He interviewed Phil Mitchell, working with men abused by women. And then we're going on to our student services, where we recognise you, the students, on your formal journey to become counsellors, psychotherapists. And today we're going to be speaking about preparing for your counselling residential experiences. They can be incredibly powerful experiences, but there are some things to consider when going into your residential. But let's start off, Rory, with that self-care strategies and navigating lone working in counselling. And I'd just like to kind of kick this off by asking you, what do you mean by lone working, Rory?
Well, I think that's a very good question. I mean working alone, in other words, working in your home alone with no one around, or maybe working in an office where there's no one around. So effectively, if anything happened, there could be a considerable amount of time before anybody found you. And this could be quite a lot of things. You know, you may become unwell and unable to contact anybody on the phone or leave the building. And, in times, in situations like that where people, may become unwell or in the very unlikely event they're attacked by a client, in the very, very unlikely event, then time is of the essence. And the longer the time ticks by, the more of a chance that when the person's eventually found, they may very well be in some degree of difficulty. So having a self-care strategy and a lone working plan is really essential.
Yeah, thank you, Rory. I think that really outlines what that is nicely. And I guess the other side of the coin is if you're working within an agency or within an organization, you're going to have a number of staff that are around. Maybe there's a receptionist. But when you are working on your own, maybe in private practice or working in a agency, but you're on a call out or seeing somebody in a business, in a building without anyone else, there is a vulnerability to the counsellor. Emotions can run high in counselling. They do run high in counselling. And of course, as you said, Rory, in the very unlikely event that a client may become unwell and unstable within a session, and that can maybe result in a threat, or the counsellor can feel unsafe. What are you going to do if you do feel unsafe? Maybe in a placement, you might have a button that you might press that would alert someone, but if you're on your own, you don't have that. And then how can you let people know that you are safe and sound before and after that session? And Rory, you've taken some time to put together 5 essential tips for ensuring safety in counselling. We're going to work through these, and then we'll tell you where you can actually go and get this super duper handout, one of Rory's handcrafted handouts. They're always incredibly valuable.
Handmade handouts.
And they are all free. That's the best part of this. So we're going to start with the initial assessment, Rory, and I think that this is really, really important because it kind of gives us the idea of who this person is before we see them. And that could be a document that is referred through to us, or there's other ways. And you've suggested, if there is an opportunity, Rory, maybe to speak to them on the phone, if it is possible, or even better, evaluate this person who might be coming to see you for the first time via video.
Yes. Yes. And I think these are 2 very useful ways of assessing a client. They're valuable ways anyway, because if you can do an initial meeting, we've talked about the 20-minute, half an hour free meeting. If you can do that over video, then you get a very good sense of who the client is. Or you could do it on the phone. Obviously, you haven't got the visual cues, but you can hear who the client is. And I think that can be very, very useful. It can be useful just in general practice, because it means that, if you don't have to go into your office that particular day, you can work from home, use the video feed, do the initial assessment, and then arrange to meet the client at your office if you're working, face to face. And before we go on, the reason I brought this is that I'm a member of a number of Facebook groups, including our own, which is Counselling Tutor. So if you want to join our Facebook group, go to Facebook, type in Counselling Tutor. If you're a regular listener, you'll know the score. Just knock on the door and we're going to let you in. And you'll see conversations which are really interesting and really focus on the kind of concerns that come up for private practitioners, people who are working for themselves. So this has come up quite often. And I do think that having some sort of safety plan's essential, which really brings us on to trusting your instincts. Your instincts sometimes always aren't the best barometer over facts, but I think initially it's very useful to be able to trust your instincts. And I think listening to your instincts during initial evaluations or consultations is crucial. And if something feels off, you could refer the client to another professional or another person in the building or a counselling location for the initial meeting. You could make sure, what I'm trying to say here is, you could make sure there was someone else in the building when you met the client for the first time. And I have to say, in the Facebook groups that I'm a member of quite a few therapy Facebook groups, and there seems to be quite a discussion about, shall we say, clients who are calling for a different service than counselling, who may be phoning for something that's maybe different to what's being offered in counselling. I've seen similar horror stories, and that is sadly a reality. And this is, I think, why we're having this discussion. We really need to consider your safety as a practitioner. It needs to come first. It's paramount in our practice. We need to be well and present and free of anxiety and fear to be able to be there for a client. So even if we have a seed of doubt in the background about this person, I think this is what you're speaking about here, trusting your instincts. Can you fully be there? Can you fully be connected with that client in that moment if you've got a bit of a doubt or a niggle? I can look back on my life, Rory. There are many times in my life where I did not trust my gut feel, where I went against my gut feel. And many times that went terribly wrong. So I guess it's a wisdom thing that eventually you get a gut feel that you can use to kind of direct you there. And of course, so we've looked at
the initial assessment or looking at this person before they come in, with looking at trusting your own instincts and potentially being able to speak to them or even see them before they come in, I would consider looking at what is the presentation. So if the person is coming in for violent anger outbursts, that would kind of be a clue that you might want to put in some additional support. Not that they would do anything, and we're not suggesting that would happen, but it's about looking to your instincts and putting the protocols in place. And we now go on to number 3 on this list, which is those safety protocols. And Rory, can you kind of give us an outline of what safety protocols we can put in place?
Absolutely, Ken. So one of the things is you can have a safety buddy, and that's someone who knows that you're going to be working alone that day, and you can send them a text after the session to say you're okay. And what I would say is, you send the text when you're sat either on the vehicle or on public transport on the way home, not when you're in the office as you go, not when you're alone. You send the text when you're around people, and that's critical, because if you send a text and say, right, my client's gone, you're still alone in the building. So make sure that when you send your text, you're either securely in your car. Obviously, you're not driving at this point. You're parked up. You don't have to point that out nowadays. But or if you're using public transport, or if you walk, if you're on the street, you could just send a text and say, "I'm clear now of my appointment," and your body and get your buddy to respond and say, "Okay, thank you." And that's something that I used for quite a time when I was a support worker. I used to go out and do a lot of lone working when I worked in both mental health, helping people who were coming from secure units into their own accommodation, and also when I worked for NACRO, when I worked with people who've been offenders, I was assisting them kind of reintegrating into society, and it was a very strict rule. And if you didn't text, then the protocol was someone called the police. And that happened on a number of occasions when people forgot to do it, and as a consequence, the police turned up. Not very happy, I have to say. But that is a really good idea. And also, you could start a group if you know a number of therapists and you know them and you trust them. You could have a small group and you could work together to offer check-in and check-out protocols. And it's a very, very effective. It's a very simple system. But it works. It really does. It really does work, and it gives you peace of mind. I think that's the key thing, to know that there's someone got your back. There's someone out there. So if something happens and you don't check in, you know that the cavalry's on the way.
Definitely, I think it's a really important point there under safety protocols. It's that perhaps checking in with somebody else where you have that arrangement pre-made. Just as the clients arrived, you can say, right, client's just arrived now. Before you kind of welcome that client in, they will know around about an hour later they should be receiving a follow-up text from you to say that you're okay. And if they don't hear from you after that hour, and they've kind of factored in the time it might take you to just say goodbye to the person, they can take an action, and that might be reaching out to you to make sure you're okay, and that might be then reporting that up a chain. Like you said, Rory, within your example there, it may even be the police, depending on how you are working and what you've set up. And that's why it's important to set up those safety protocols. And I love the idea of starting a group, because you get to kind of share ideas within a group and see what works for other people. And then, of course, there's the last resort identification that you've put on, Rory, at number 4 in these tips, which is to consider having a sealed envelope containing your appointments, names, and contact details that a third party can access if something happens. It's almost like in emergency, break the glass. If you can't hear from me, you can't contact me, you don't know where I am, check this envelope. That's going to give you a heads up of what my movements are and who I've been seeing, Rory.
Absolutely. And the reason I wrote this was because as I was writing the handout, I had to nip out of the office. And when I came back, my computer had locked and I had to put my password in. And I thought to myself, a number of therapists now, quite rightly so, are very, very, very kind of security conscious. And they secure, we've talked about this so often with data protection. They secure their notes in, a password protected folder. But, if you're working alone, time is of the essence. And if if someone didn't come back from an appointment and, they were trying to find out where that person was, if you had to crack someone's computer open, it can be done, but it takes time. Having a last resort identification, in other words, just an envelope, a sealed envelope you can leave on your desk at home, just with your appointment schedule, name and addresses, you could just destroy it afterwards. Then you know that in the worst case scenario, break glass basically, and the assistance can come to you because, as as we might go on to talk about in this podcast, with a certain case that happened a good few years ago, time was very, very crucial, and as time passed, the chances of finding the person became less and less. And I'm talking about Susie Lamplugh, the estate agent, who went to an appointment and never returned. And they don't know where she is now. They know that she's probably sadly dead, but they don't know any other details than that. There are some suspicions, and I think someone may have been charged recently, but it was time that hampered the police because they didn't know where to look.
Yeah.
So last resort identification, very, very useful.
Thank you, Rory. And, it's interesting that we have to look at things like this because we protect our clients' details. I mean, it's part of the law is protecting those details. But when it comes to our own personal safety, if they are locked away and behind a password or something, nobody can access them, and somebody needs to know who it was that we were seeing, it's important that they're able to access that information for our safety. And then emergency communications. This is number 5 on the 5 essential working tips to ensuring safety in counselling work. We've spoken now about kind of what you can put in place before the session in terms of the assessment and how you might have somebody looking out for you before and after to make sure that you're okay. But the emergency communication might be that something comes up in the session and you have a need to reach out and let somebody know that you are in a distressful situation, Rory. And I guess what you've put here is that always keep a phone or other communication device with significant numbers pre-saved. In a time of crisis, it can be really difficult to think clearly. You want a very, very simple protocol to be able to reach out and call somebody. And there are also some applications that you've mentioned here, Rory, for loan working.
Yes, there are, and you can look if you kind of look at the Apple Store or the Google Store. You can find loan working apps. I found quite a few of them, but I can't vouch for the quality of them or how well they work. But maybe do your own research. And the other thing that you need to think about is always charge your phone up. So every time your phone's at rest, plug it in and charge it up, because nobody wants to be in a situation where they pick the phone up and it's the battery's flat.
Yeah.
So always charge your phone up. And I'm also recommending, they're not connected with Counselling Tutor at all, the Susie Lamplugh Trust. I talked about Susie Lamplugh, who in the 80s was an estate agent. She went out to see a man called Mr. Kipper at a property on her own, and she never, ever returned. And when they looked in, I've done the Susie Lamplugh Trust training. I have to say it's really, really good. And one of the things that they talked about was the fact they had no details. They didn't know who this person was. There was no contact details. It was literally a name. It was almost certainly a made-up name. And nobody in her office knew where she'd gone. And that time was ticking away. And I think also from the training I did, it wasn't just about working as a therapist. It was about keeping an eye on your environment. I learned so much about keeping an eye on my environment, making sure that when I was going anywhere, I could make an assessment of how safe I was. And that's really, really important. Just kind of open my eyes to the kind of things I need to look out for. And at the bottom of this piece, I'd say that, but I would think that 99.9% of the people you meet as a therapist, they're going to be okay people who just want help. We don't want to see every client as a perpetrator. However, we do need to kind of do some due diligence just to make sure we're okay. And once we feel okay in ourselves, we're going to be there and better for our clients, I think, Ken.
Yeah. The final lines on the handout: by implementing these strategies, you can create a safer working environment for yourself and your client, ensuring, and this is what you've just said, that the focus remains on providing that quality service in a safe setting where you don't have a seed of doubt, where you can fully be there and integrated with that client as we intend to be. And Rory, as you mentioned, we cover this topic as a consideration. As you said, the chances are really, really, really low. And one of the things you say, Rory, is that we always believe and hope for the best, but we have to plan for something that might go wrong, and at least have a think about it. And you're speaking, as we kind of back out of this topic, about being aware of your environment. It's things like, where are you sitting in the room? If something did happen, do you have access to a doorway that you can get out first? If something does start escalating within a session, are you able to have a pre-planned script of, oh, excuse me, I'm sorry to interrupt you, but I just need to visit the bathroom, that you can get out of the room to maybe reach out and make a call? Because of course it could escalate if you're making the call in the room with the person. And speaking of the apps, just going back onto those, and we of course don't recommend any, there are some covert alert apps as well, where you can say certain words and that your phone might pick that up. And I guess that just brings up things like, should you have a phone that's listening for words in a counselling session? And this is where it kind of becomes about you looking and finding out what is right for you and what is right for your practice. But there are covert alarms that would, you push a button on your phone a certain number of times and it will send a message out to somebody. So there it is. If you want to get the handout, it's free of charge, 5 essential tips for ensuring safety in counselling work. You can get that. Just go to counsellingtutor.com. That is our main website. Click on the podcast tab. Find your way to episode 296. There are all of the show notes of what we've spoken about today, and you can download this handout, and it does have a link within that as well to the website that Rory was mentioning and the training that he had undertaken. So you can click on that and go and check that out as well. And that brings us to the end of today's ethical, sustainable practice. And as we're back out of ethical, sustainable practice, right into practice matters, into our interview, into the CPD section of the Counselling Tutor Podcast. Rory, you reached out and you spoke with Phil Mitchell on working with men abused by women.
Yes. Now, as I said in the introduction to this, I've worked with too many, if I can use that phrase, women who have been abused by men, and men who hate women. But I've also met men who have been on the receiving end of really hateful behaviour, dangerous behaviour, violent behaviour from women who hate men. It's something that's not really talked about. So I was really pleased to hook up with Phil Mitchell, who's a specialist in this field, and talk about men abused by women. And this is what he had to say.
Practice Matters is proudly sponsored by the Counsellor CPD Library. To access top quality, relevant continuing professional development for your practice that you can do at a time that suits you, and all for less than the price of a cup of coffee, visit counsellingtutor.com.
As practitioners, many of us have encountered female clients who have suffered abuse at the hands of men who harbour a deep-seated hatred for women or consider women to be inferior. Men who possess these attitudes are often labelled as misogynists, a term that signifies a hatred of women. However, the concept of misandry is not widely discussed. It refers to the hatred of men by women. Male clients who are victims of female abuse often remain invisible and lacking in support, which is why I'm pleased to have the opportunity to speak today with Phil Mitchell, an expert in working with male abuse and assisting men whom women have abused.
Thank you for inviting me. It's a good opportunity to talk about an issue that is often ignored.
Yes, as I said in intro, I think it's voices that sometimes not heard, and I think it's really good to hear unheard voices, and also a very real very real issue. Recently, I saw a YouTube video of that was a social experiment. So basically, it was someone filmed outside the park. A man simulated an attack on a woman, and huge amounts of people came to aid the woman, which is brilliant, and helped the person out. And then eventually it was declared as a social experiment. No harm done, just a social experiment. Interestingly enough, when they did the same experiment with a woman attacking a man, people were basically laughing at the man. They were laughing at the man. And it kind of proved a point, maybe not in a too scientific way, that we don't sometimes see male abuse. We don't actually maybe take it seriously or think it's a thing. So, Phil, your practice, I guess, specialises in working with those men who may have been victims of abuse by women.
Yeah, absolutely. So, and again, not just by women, by other men as well in some cases, same-sex relationships or an abusive father. So, but yeah, no, absolutely. And the social experiment you mentioned, that I think is one of 5 similar social experiments that I've seen where they all show the same findings. The man is depicting being violent or abusive towards the woman. Plenty of people rush in and stop. And then the scenario is changed around and we see the woman depicted being violent towards the man, and people laugh, people joke, people ignore it. And again, I think, it's really interesting because we often hear that males are the privileged ones in societies. I would argue that actually women are protected, men are neglected. And I think that's something we see a lot. People don't like hearing that. And I think, yes, it's an important issue to talk about. So I've been working as a therapist about 19 and a half years in the voluntary sector, in private practice, as a volunteer, in lots of different ways. And, I specialise in working with boys and men that have been sexually abused as adults or as children. But actually through doing that work, I've, I suppose unintentionally, if you like, found that I've worked with other men who have been victims of sexual abuse, domestic abuse, both in some cases, men that have been sexually abused and also at the same time falsely accused of abuse by their perpetrator. And so false allegations come in. And so I've found that I've worked with a lot of boys and men. I've adapted my practice quite radically, if you like, and quite massively to make use of what psychology calls sort of male-friendly approaches. And I've seen a massive increase in boys and men getting in touch with me. But one of the issues that can sometimes come up, not always, is the issue of misandry. And we talk a lot about misogyny, which the general definition is the hatred, contempt, and or dislike of girls and women because they're girls and women. And misandry is kind of the opposite. It's the hatred, contempt, and or dislike of boys and men because they're boys and men. And I should say that women can also have misogynistic views about men. I'll say that again. That women can also have misogynistic views about other women, and men can have misandristic views about other men as well. It's not just men versus women and women versus men. Of course, it can be. But I think what often happens is that when I and when others talk about sort of the issues affecting men and the harm facing men, the disadvantages facing men, the two responses that always happen is you get people diverting away from the harm experienced by men and they divert straight onto the harm perpetrated by men. Or they will go, women have got it worse. So they'll divert away from the harm and disadvantage experienced by men and go straight on to women have got it worse. It's always one of those two. And misandry, the hatred of boys and men, is often, not always, but is often a part of that abuse. I have worked with boys and men, spoken to men online, had people get in touch, and it's pretty clear that the abuse they suffered was to some degree motivated by misandry, where their partner, you're a man, you should be able to deal with this. A real man wouldn't do this, they would do that. A real man wouldn't need to wear a condom. Why do you want to do that? You can never hit me because I'll go to police, but you should be able to take a few light slaps from me because you're a man. And so when you've got explicit comments like that, it's pretty clear that to some degree misandry is a motivating factor. Now, what happens is you get people who I'm sure you might know who have said misandry doesn't exist. It is absolute 100% rubbish. What happens is people are looking at how they believe misogyny exists And then they compare how misandry exists to that, and they basically say or imply, well, because misandry doesn't exist in the same or similar way that misogyny does, that means it doesn't exist. That's utterly ridiculous. Two forms of hate and prejudice existing differently is not proof that one exists and one doesn't. It isn't. And often what you have is you've got people who will say, for example, men murdering women, that is misogyny. Now, context here, there will absolutely be times where men murdering women, their actions are motivated to some degree by misogyny, right? That's kind of us. But the implication that all the men that murder women, that is always misogyny, we don't know that. Because you need to prove that the attitude of hatred for women is there. We don't know that. If you have, for example, a bisexual man and he beats up his male partner when he's with them, and then he gets angry and beats up his female partner, well, it's more about his issues around anger and how he expresses that and so on, and perhaps less about his hatred for any sort of demographic. But as I say, what you have is you've got people that will say, well, when men are killing women, that is misogyny, which, again, we don't know that is always the case, but they will say men killing women is misogyny, and if that is the case, that's the extreme end of misogyny, and they compare that to the mild end of misandry. So there's a real false equivalence there, and they go, well, it's just people going online saying kill all men. That's it's just hurt feelings and things like that. So they're comparing the mild end of misandry to the extreme end of what they believe, rightly or wrongly, is misogyny. So the whole thing is set up in this really disingenuous, irrational, illogical way. And so often, you can speak to people, and when you have the discussion with them, say, look, if I go online now and say, look, I hate men, I will go online and say, I hate men, I can't stand men, I hate them all. I have just clearly shown that misandry exists. It's as simple as that. Now, people will go, yes, but it's only hurt feelings, or misandry only, it makes you cry, it doesn't kill you, and all of that. There are a number of examples where women have killed men, perpetrated severe harm against them, and there is clear evidence that misandry is /was a motivating factor. But the problem is that when a man does anything negative towards a woman, whether it's a little bit critical to horrific abuse, the assumption is misogyny. And the key word there is assumption. It might be misogyny, it might not, but we assume it is because the aggressor is male and the target's female. But then we turn it round. And when a woman does anything critical, negative, or really abusive to a man, we never even consider that it might be motivated by misandry. So there's a real bias, a real imbalance in terms of how the picture is put across. But the blunt reality is it exists, it has a definition, and the definition is that it is an attitude. How that attitude influences behaviour and how that attitude can look, we can discuss and debate that forever and a day. But we can't say it doesn't exist, because it quite literally does exist. It has a definition and it's an attitude. And again, we just need to discuss how we evidence the attitude.
Yes, and given what you've said, what are the challenges that men have accessing therapy? So, I've certainly in my practice, and I've practiced for nearly 20 years. I have to say that in all the time that I practiced, majority of the people who came to me were female. Majority of them, a significant majority, were had been victims of male on female crime. I'm not going to use the word misogyny, given the context that you've given, but male on female crime. But yeah. I have had 2 or 3 men who've come to me who've clearly been victims of female and male crime. And one of the things that struck me, it was so hard for those men to come forward. I can't speak about cases for reasons of confidentiality, but I think if I generally observed that things like sexual abuse, being stabbed or hit, being humiliated in public, and the person didn't. I know there are some people who like being humiliated in public, but this person didn't want to be humiliated in public. And in all the cases of the men I work with, it seemed a bit of a struggle to admit that that it had happened, and somehow, and I'm putting inverted commas in the air, they'd allowed it to happen because they were the stronger ones.
Yeah, absolutely. So in answer to your question, what are the barriers? I mean, the barriers for boys and men engaged in therapy have been documented for years, haven't they? And I think, if you read a lot of the literature from the world of psychology, Perspectives in Male Psychology by John Barry and Louise Liddon, the Palgrave Handbook of Male Psychology and Mental Health by John Barry, Martin Seeger, and another psychologist, they reference a huge amount of academic research and science. And there's lots of reasons why boys and men don't engage in therapy, but one of there's lots. So, for example, the main one in my view is what we hear on average, and I emphasise this now. I'm not being absolute. I'm not saying all men and all women, but on average, what the research tells us is that on average, women want to come to therapy and express their emotions and talk about the feelings, whereas men want to come to therapy and, on average, take action and find a solution. And there is nothing wrong with that. But I think what we've done, and the colleges and universities to some degree have perhaps got something to answer for here, is we've pathologized that. Why don't these men just want to sit and talk? Why can't these men just sit and be? Why can't they just express their feelings? And all that. And I think for me, it's like, well, why should they? If they don't want to and they don't feel comfortable doing that, and there is a different way of engaging them that is legal, ethical, safe, and helps them engage in a more effective manner, and that contributes towards achieving a positive outcome, what is wrong with that? Why is that? What is wrong with that? And so again, we don't do it the other way around. So we would never dream of saying, well, women just need to stop talking about their emotions. They just need to come and find a solution to their problem. We would absolutely hear mass outrage. It'd be terrible. But when some of those same people say men just need to stop wanting to fix things and men just need to, they just need to say, oh, that's absolutely fine. Because we live in a society that the main, perhaps even the only demographic that it's okay to daily dehumanize and demonize and denigrate and treat like absolute scum is men. And we do very little about it. There's an article in The Guardian that came out yesterday saying, The Guardian, we want to hear from professionals, teachers and community workers. What do you think about the attitude boys have about girls? No one is even asking at all about the attitude girls might have about boys, which is very interesting because you just have to go online and the massive amount of misandry, kill all men tweets, all of that, huge. There are more accounts online dedicated to hating men than hating women. There are more accounts online dedicated to kill all men than kill all women. There are more accounts online with people highlighting that they're a proud misandrist compared to being a proud misogynist. And I think that's because misogyny is absolutely unacceptable and it's condemned and there are headlines and there's funding going into tackling it. Whereas misandry, we're fine. We keep doing it every day. We celebrate it. We promote it. We do it. And that element can affect boys and men having therapy. So I've spoke with a number of men over the years. And again, everything I'm saying today, I have permission to share. But they basically said, I saw one therapist and she was really, really nice and really lovely, but she was saying that, how can we fix your toxic masculinity? What is it about my toxic masculinity? And if you read John Barry's research around contemporary issues in dealing with masculinity, his study, I think there's a sample of just over 4,000 people. The vast majority of them are saying that they thought toxic masculinity was a harmful term and probably did more harm than good. There's probably going to be more research coming out over the years as well that tells us this. But again, it's almost like it's that buzzword, we use it. But when boys and men are not stupid, and they will be able to get a sense from their therapist, implicitly or even perhaps explicitly, that this person does not like men. This person seems to have views that men are a problem. Masculinity is a problem that needs fixing. Well, how's that going to make me feel as a guy? I don't like that. Yeah. And maybe what I want someone who's going to understand the issues boys and men face, who isn't going to pathologize me, who isn't going to say, yes, boys and men are the problem, who isn't going to say your masculinity is bad, let's fix it, who isn't going to say you are privileged because you're a male and you're part of the patriarchy, how can we help that? But boys and men are going online, they read the newspapers, they watch the news, they're in classrooms, they see all of this anti-male thing everywhere. So they are now a little bit more cautious than they might have been when they want to engage with people who are meant to help them. That's one issue. The other one is, again, as I've said, we expect on average boys and men to engage in therapy effectively in a way that girls and women do.
Let's pick up on that point because there are differences. I mean, it's one of the interesting things is that many years ago there was a really high profile case of a football coach who'd been convicted of abusing young boys. Mm-hmm. And I said to my wife at the time, watch my phone ring off the hook now with men coming forward. And sure enough, and I think most therapists will experience this, when there's a high profile case of abuse, usually it prompts people to, phone up and make an appointment. And it's quite interesting that it's a very different way of working. I found as a man, and I speak as a man, a very different way of working with men as I'd worked with women. As you say, generally speaking, and all I can say is how I've experienced the world, is that men tend to want to be more solution focused. What can I do? How does a therapist meet that difference and effectively work with it?
Well, there's lots of different ways. So again, I'd certainly recommend anybody who's listening, read the Palgrave Handbook of Male Psychology and Mental Health, read Perspectives in Male Psychology, read the briefing paper that the British Psychological Society released in November 2022, which gives hints and tips on how to use what we might call male-friendly methods to engage with men. So there's stuff out there. I think the world of psychology, in my view, streets ahead of the world of counselling. They are a lot less likely to pathologise men or see them as a problem and acknowledge the differences. But sometimes it's just using subtle language change. So, for example, rather than saying to, if a man is sitting in front of you and he goes, I'm here, I can't deal with my problem, I just can't deal with it, can I? And I'm weak, and that's why I've ended up here, and I don't want to be here. And, some people might focus on emotions and feelings and go, it's okay to be vulnerable. It's okay to be here. It's okay to be vulnerable. You are going to be vulnerable, and it's okay to feel that way with me and empathise and validate. And that response, there's nothing wrong with it if it works and he responds to it. The problem is if you keep doing those sorts of emotional focused empathic responses and he doesn't like it, he doesn't feel he's getting movement, it's not enough for him, he wants a little bit more action and solution. So a different way of doing that, using elements of what psychologist Martin Seeger calls archetypal masculinity, you reframe it and maybe say, do you know what, I guess that's one way of looking at it, but could there be another way? Could there be another way, like, honestly, you don't really want to be here and it's difficult for you to be here, and you've got through that difficulty by making the appointment, going through with the appointment, and you're still sitting here now, and you're saying that maybe you coming here shows that you're not dealing with things. Maybe you coming here is the start of you dealing with things, and this is the start of you tackling your problems and taking control. And some people go, and anyone who's hearing this who gets immediately defensive about it, ask yourself why. Why are you defensive? One size does not fit all, and we should not assume it does, regardless of gender and anything. But it doesn't. But there are average differences. The science, the literature, the research backs it up. I used to think, and I'm a bit embarrassed to say it, but the reality is I used to think all of the differences that we see between men and women, it's all because of society, it's all because of upbringing, it's all because of environment. It has nothing to do with biology, nothing. Then I read huge amounts of research, literature and all that, and I thought, I was wrong. It's nature and nurture, not nature or nurture. Now, how much one is more influential than the other depends on, that's a different issue, but it's both. And so I changed my approach. I changed my website. So rather than saying something like, come to therapy, express your emotions, talk about your feelings, it's okay to be vulnerable, I changed the wording on my website to tackle your problems, take control, etc. And when I did that, I saw a significant increase in men getting in touch with me for therapy. And that's when I thought, this clearly works. And then in the therapy, and I monitored outcomes and all of that, I thought, this is working. I'm seeing more men. Men are engaging more. They're achieving a positive outcome more effectively. So this clearly works. Nothing illegal, nothing unethical. It was safe. They felt comfortable. So there are people that will say, well, masculinity doesn't really lend itself to vulnerability, does it? So isn't that a problem? Well, it's only a problem if you believe that encouraging that man to be vulnerable is the only option available to you, and it isn't. Now, the problems like femininity and masculinity, the problem is if it's too rigid. So if a guy is saying, for example, I should never cry. Well, hang on, never. What do you mean never? Maybe there are times where, it's not best to cry. You probably shouldn't cry. If you're a primary school teacher, you don't want to be stood in front of 30 kids crying your eyes out because someone in your family's died. It's not appropriate and so on. But later on, it might be. Do you feel the urge to cry? How can you do that? Do you not feel the urge to cry? Well, that's okay. So it's about the rigidity and the beliefs around that are the problems. The masculinity itself can actually be utilised to help boys and men deal with their problems. And I think if we start to acknowledge that more, I think we might see more boys and men come into therapy.
Yes, and I think that also, there's another statistic about male suicide. It tends to be more prolific. We're seeing it more and more. The statistics I recently read would show that there's been a rise in male suicide, certainly in certain age groups. So, I think that helping men talk about what's going on for them, providing a space that meets men where they are, and I think I would broadly agree with you that environment, genetics loads the gun, and environment pulls the trigger. I think we're a mixture of biology and how that biology is played out in the environments we live. And it may be worth thinking next time you come across a hashtag that says "kill all men," maybe worth just taking a time to reflect and think, what might be a joke to some people may be literally a matter of life and death for some men. And I have to say, in terms of the feminist movement, I've got a lot of female friends who would describe themselves as feminists, and they are all lovely. They define themselves in the world as who they are, want to make their part of the world one that they can grow and develop and be seen as equals, and be in an arena with, I guess, the rest of humanity. But it's not at the cost of men. It's a kind of a joint venture, if you like. Yeah. But it's been a very interesting discussion, and if I were to ask you what you hope that people would take away from our time together, what would you offer?
Well, I think in very vague general terms, I'd when we're talking about this issue, I think a balance, like with any important issue, a balance of logic and emotion is what's needed to have the discussion, rather than very little logic and massive amounts of emotion. So a good balance of that is what I find is useful to have these discussions. I think as well, there's something like, don't compete for victimhood. That's the thing. The men that I've spoken to, they don't want, not all of them, but the vast majority of them, in my experience, they don't want to go, men have got it worse than women. Some do, I think, to be fair, but the majority don't. We just want acknowledgement. There are issues that uniquely and or disproportionately affect boys and men, and we don't want to be kept in the dark whilst we shine a massive spotlight only on issues affecting girls and women. So ultimately, it's about what can we do to get more balance? What can we do to, be fair? And ultimately, when you see headlines, things on the news, social media things, soap opera storylines, anything that's out there in the world that gives that message that it's okay to dehumanize men, maybe we should stop and just think, how might this message be seen by boys and men that are out there, and how might that possibly contribute towards some sort of adversity? The boys and men out there who are taking their own life, the boys and men who are most of the victims of homicide, the boys and men who are most of the victims of street attacks, stabbings, paternity fraud, false allegations, unreported sexual abuse, non-reciprocal domestic abuse. We can go on forever. Homelessness, drugs deaths. The basic index of gender equality says that in, I think, about 68% of countries, when you look at life satisfaction, happiness and education, males are more disadvantaged than females. But we don't talk about any of this because it goes against the narrative that we have to shine a light on men bad, women good. Men abusers, women abused, and it's just not as black and white as that. And so anyone who's listening to this, I'd like them to take away that just stop and think that reflect on any potential views and attitudes you might have. If you see something out there, think about your sons, your brothers, your male friends. Think about them. Do they hate this anti-male rhetoric that's out there, but maybe they're too nervous to say anything? So again, let's just challenge it, obviously appropriately, as best we can and as often as we can, because the more we challenge it, the more power we have to try and dismantle it. Yeah.
So in summary, it's not a competition, and we should recognise both sides of the coin, and act appropriately. Phil Mitchell, thank you so much for joining us today.
Massive thank you to Phil Mitchell. Thank you to you, Rory, again for bringing us the experts in the field and having the interesting discussion that inform us in our practice. Moving away now from practice matters and recognizing you, our students, as we run into student services. Student Services is sponsored by Counselling Skills Academy. Have you ever wondered if you're using counselling skills effectively? Confidentiality means we rarely see skills used by others, so it's no wonder that so many students say they lack confidence in their counselling skills. That's why I built Counselling Skills Academy. Counselling Skills Academy is an online course that you can do at your own pace. It will give you the skills competence and confidence to know that you're using your skills most effectively. You will see real counselling skills used by a counsellor in real life sessions, covering everything from how risk is assessed right through to working towards an appropriate ending. Visit counsellingskillsacademy.com to learn more and to claim your counselling tutor discount. That's counsellingskillsacademy.com. And today in Student Services, we're speaking about preparing for your counselling residential experience. It's interesting, Rory. I'm thinking back now, if you're on a formal counselling training, undoubtedly, specifically in the United Kingdom, you're going to be asked to go on a number of residentials over the years of your study. They are compulsory. They are there for your personal growth and development. And, this talk we're going to do now is about how you see it as more than just a date in the diary for something you need to rock up for. And I think anyone that's been to a residential and felt the power of it will understand what I'm talking about, Rory.
Yeah, absolutely. And for those of you thinking, what a residential is, because I'm aware that not all training providers offer this, but a residential is where the students and the tutor go away, usually to some form of retreat, and spend the time focusing on personal development, and that's done with taught workshops where you taught theory, and then you go away and think about how the theory impacted on you. And I can remember the Monday after my first level 3 residential, sitting on a rock at a reservoir not far away from where I now live, looking into the sky and thinking, what happened? What happened? It rocked my life. It changed my life forever, absolutely forever. And I remember coming back and my wife saying, how did it go? And I went, where do you start? Where do you start? It was almost like someone had downloaded a new operating system in me. And I could see my way of being with a lot more clarity. So the reason I'm sharing this is that, it's different for everybody, but in my experience, leading residentials and certainly being part of a student cohort on the residential, it is a very, very powerful, it's a very powerful thing that you're moving into. So in terms of preparedness, I think the first thing is just to acknowledge that it's going to be eye-opening and heart-opening and emotion-opening, and to embrace that, lean into it, prepare to lean into it, because that's where the real work's done. That's where the real work's done in personal development, where you lean in to that stuff that maybe you don't look at, maybe you just pop under the carpet or stick on the shelf. And when you're at a residential, you're faced with it. You're faced with yourself, and that can sometimes be the toughest person to be faced with.
Yeah. And this is what we ask of our clients. This is why we go through this process. And as you've said so many times, Rory, that personal development is forged in fire. It doesn't come easy. You don't read a book and personally evolve. You can get ideas and theories, but it's the thinking and the self-processing that kind of applies that to self. And it's where knowledge becomes wisdom. Knowledge is knowing a bunch of facts. Wisdom is feeling it and knowing how it applies to you and your life and your life experiences. And I guess you're mentioning about the power, Rory, and that was your journey. And I can share my journey was equally as powerful. You were there, Rory. You were the tutor. I was a student, and you know how powerful it was for me. And I found myself broken down, sobbing during my residential experience, not in sadness. Now that's interesting, and I would struggle today to convey in words what the emotion was that I was feeling at that time. It certainly wasn't sadness. It was a mixture of so much stuff that even now today, when I'm looking back at that moment, I can feel the hairs on my arms raising. It was a significant moment. But similarly, you know, the process of personal development is personal, and there needs to be an openness of self. And this is why we're speaking about this. In preparation, what can you do? Well, perhaps with your journaling or with your quiet time where you might contemplate and think about the upcoming residential, you might think about how you might be open, how you might trust, how you might let down guards that we have in our everyday run-of-the-mill lives. Because going in, being open and expecting to maybe feel some emotions that might be confusing, might be in some instances distressing, sometimes it can be relieving. It's a plethora of emotions. And as we see in our clients, they go through this rainbow of emotions as well during the arc of therapy. And in preparation for counselling residential experience, if you can, if it is at all possible, try to book off work or take a break from whatever your daily schedule is on the day after returning from the residential, because you can find yourself in a place of much process, so much going on, so many feelings and a lot to work through and process, and having to kind of leave that and go into work the next day and say hello everybody and just forget about it is tricky. It's not impossible, and it may be that you can't do that, but if you are able to take a day's leave, it is certainly worth putting a day's leave or a day out for you, for your own self-care to process after you come back from a counselling residential experience.
Yeah, absolutely. You don't want to be doing anything too taxing on the day you come back after the weekend. And for some, it can be an away weekend where you're away just with your peers and your tutors. Some do it actually over 2 days in a college setting, but it's sometimes called psychotherapy marathons. Sometimes they refer to it as some sort of training. But yeah, make sure you have some time off, and also just be thoughtful when you go back to the people who are near and dear to you. I know that for some it is such a kind of emotional movement within self that it's kind of very hard to explain what's gone on. You can't just say, my wife, bless her, was saying, did you have some nice meals? Did you meet some nice people? It's like, yeah, we did that. Yeah, it was okay. But it was just very impossible to explain actually what had happened to me. And just be thoughtful to those nearest and dearest, because they're not going through the same process you are. And also thinking about the changes that came back. I know that I don't want to make this sound too dramatic, but actually my level 3 and level 4 were quite dramatic. I know that a lot of people who came back from residentials ended up single people not long afterwards. They separated from their partners. They changed their jobs. I did. I changed my job not long afterwards, and made some really earth-shattering life changes. So it's that powerful. It can be that powerful, not for everybody, but for some.
Yeah. And here we're speaking about counselling residentials during a study process. And of course, this can apply to retreats that you book for yourself. And I certainly do that now. And I got the seed of this from the counselling residentials. I now set my own personal goals for my own personal development, which I review quarterly. And I will go to 2, if I can, I will try and go to 2 retreats a year, where a silent retreat or a meditation retreat or somewhere where I can be alone and just look at self and reflect inwardly. Because we live in a world that is kind of taking our attention and outwardly, isn't it? We're forced to look outward all the time. And indeed, when we're working with our clients, we're kind of there with them. So it is a very special time. That protected time to really look into self and see who you really are. And a great way of processing that post a residential experience is to journal. Journaling is really, really helpful in working through that. And honestly, it was such a an experience for me, Rory, that even today I still look back on it and I still process it today. Those same emotions and thoughts and who I am comes up from that. So there it is. That is your student services preparing for your counselling residential experience. And of course, this has been the Counselling Tutor Podcast, and you've joined us for episode 296.
Yes, we started with ethical, sustainable practice, and we talked about self-care strategies and navigating lone working in counselling. Just some observations to help those who work on their own to stay safe and to maybe become a little bit more aware of the difficulties that may arise when working and lone working. We moved into practice matters with a fascinating interview with Phil Mitchell, a specialist in working with men abused by women. And then finally in student services, Ken and myself shared our observations around residential experiences, the idea that you go away as a student with your peers and your tutors and look at self. And finally, before we move out of today's episode, I'd like to ask you a bit of a favour. If you've liked this episode, if you've liked the content, why not give us a 5-star review on the platform you're listening on? If that's iTunes, just write us a review. We'd love that. We love a good review. And also, if you found it helpful, why don't you share this on your social media platforms? Share it with your friends, share it with your peers, let them hear it, and maybe introduce someone to the Counselling Tutor Podcast. Every recommendation helps us connect with more people and I guess talk to them about the wonderful world of counselling and psychotherapy. And thank you so much for allowing us to be part of your journey. We really are grateful. And as always, stay grounded and stay safe.
Take the stress out of your counselling studies and get the support of Rory and I by joining us in the Counselling Study Resource. See how Counselling Study Resource can help you. Visit counsellingtutor.com. That's counsellingtutor.com.
Thank you for listening to the Counselling Tutor Podcast. Find the show notes for this episode by visiting counsellingtutor.com.